It all began with a woman vacationing in Hawaii in the late 1980s. On her last day in the Aloha State, she received a call from her mother, warning her not to get on her flight the next day, stating that she had a bad feeling about it. The girl took her mother's advice and changed flights. When she arrived home, she learned that her initial flight had crashed, and her mother's apparent premonition had likely saved her life. This was the story that screenwriter Jeffrey Reddick read in a magazine, which became the alleged inspiration for Flight 180, a rejected spec script for the 90s TV series The X-Files, which he eventually reworked into the horror feature film Final Destination. In each Final Destination film, a character has a psychic premonition about an impending disaster, allowing the character and several colleagues to cheat death. But as time goes on, death finds each of them in unexpected and inventive ways. The idea is that you can never escape death, and if you do, it's only a matter of time before death catches up with you. It's a unique idea for a horror series, but could it be true in our world as well? From missed flights to reckless first responders to dodging bullets to a poodle falling 13 floors and causing absolute mayhem, these are the stories of those who found themselves to be the unfortunate stars of their own real-life Final Destination stories. The crash that Jeffrey Reddick claimed as the inspiration for his script is missing one aspect that some of the others are not missing. And that's the part where death continues to come after the survivor. He's never spelled out which specific crash his story is based on, but the National Transportation Safety Board has a database of aircraft crashes in the US, and I think based on that, it's most likely this one, Aloha Airlines Flight 243, which went down in April 1988 on the way from Hilo to Honolulu. There was initially nothing unusual about the flight and no dangerous weather conditions, but 23 minutes in, the roof ruptured and was torn off of the plane. One flight attendant was swept out of the vehicle, but that was the only fatality. An emergency crash landing in Maui resulted in 65 injuries, but no airline customers lost their lives. If this was the flight that Reddick read about, the woman who changed her travel plans did not actually cheat death. So there are some similarities to the movie, but it was a lot less deadly than the 287 passengers blown up in the night sky on Volee Flight 180 during the opening of Final Destination. However, the true inspiration for the movie is disputed. There are many who say it's actually based on TWA Flight 800. If it's been a while since you've seen Final Destination, it follows a high school student, Alex Browning, whose French class is taking a field trip to Paris, and when he has his vision, he freaks out, resulting in him and 6 others missing their flight and subsequently their date with death.
There they go. Here we stay.
TWA Flight 800 lines up with that pretty closely. It's a flight from New York City to Paris. It left in the evening, and 12 minutes after takeoff, it exploded and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving no survivors of the 230 passengers. Of those whose lives were lost, 16 students and 5 chaperones from a Pennsylvania high school French class were on board. It's pretty clear to me that at least the circumstances of Volee Flight 180 are inspired by TWA Flight 800, even if Reddick got the psychic premonition idea from a different aviation wreck. There was a bit of a controversy around this when film reviewer Roger Ebert criticized Final Destination for being in poor taste, exploiting a real tragedy for a campy horror movie plot. The screenwriter responded in an interview with Bloody Disgusting. The biggest misconception about the original spec script is the one that has bothered me the most. When the movie came out in 2000, a lot of reviewers said the story was inspired by the real-life crash of TWA Flight 800 in 1996. I got flack for that, but I actually wrote this in 1994. I do think the director may have used news footage from the crash in the film, so that's where that rumor came from. So he's basically throwing the director, James Wong, under the bus. Final Destination pun definitely intended. When he says he wrote it in 1994, Reddick is referring to the original X-Files script, so I'm gonna do what nobody seems to have done for some reason and read the damn script. In the X-Files script, the flight takes off out of Newark, New Jersey, headed to Boston, as opposed to Final Destination and Real Life, which both departed from JFK in New York, with their destination being Paris. In the X-Files, the character who has the premonition is Charles Scully, the younger brother of the show's main protagonist, Dana Scully, and a bunch of random people get off with him. In Final Destination, everyone who gets off is part of the French class. All 3 crashes are followed by FBI investigation. So at some point between the X-Files spec in 1994 and this treatment sold to New Line Cinema in 1997, which mentioned students practicing French and a trip to Europe, the details were changed to be more in line with what really happened on TWA 800, which was right in between in 1996.
Coincidence? I think not!
That being said, Reddick maintains that the original treatment featured all adult characters, and they were changed to teens for a different reason. There was something else that happened in 1996. The release and and overwhelming success of Scream. Reddick told Consequence.net that teenagers were hot again in horror films. New Line wanted to make them all teenagers. But the French class thing is hard to overlook. Now, that being said, I don't care. I'm not offended by Final Destination being similar to a real crash. All fiction comes from a place of reality, whether it's obvious or not. And I don't really like the idea that it's fine for other genres to do it, drama, comedy, sci-fi, literally everything else, but all of a sudden when a horror movie is based on reality, it's in poor taste? No, they're just racist. I guess genre-ist? Is that a word? It's time to rise up. But it was the great poet Oscar Wilde who said, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life." And that's exactly what happened after the release of Final Destination. Only the imitations were even spookier than the crashes that allegedly inspired the movie. And the first one, taking place just a year after the release of the movie, may be one of the most haunting. The two flights that came before Final Destination didn't have the aspect that made the film so interesting, the person who is later killed after surviving their first disaster. But just a year and a half later, this concept would become a reality. Hilda Yolanda Mayol was a 26-year-old Dominican woman living in New York, where she was a waitress at a restaurant in the World Trade Center. She was there on September 11th, 2001, when an American Airlines jet was hijacked and crashed into the tower 90-some floors above her, and managed to get out of the building before it collapsed. After such a close call with death, Mayol planned to go on vacation back to the Dominican Republic to take her mind off of the nearly fatal incident. Her mom went ahead with her two kids, and she planned to meet them there after a couple weeks, flying out on November 12th, 2001. Surely, with the entire world on high alert, there could not be another airplane tragedy so soon, right? Well, ironically, it was another flight out of JFK International Airport in New York. They quickly hit heavy turbulence, and while trying to overcorrect, the captain caused the plane to sideslip, resulting in the tail fin breaking off and plunging into the bay, which sent the plane crashing down into a neighborhood in Queens. We can only imagine what was going through Yolanda's head during the 22-second fall from the skies. Was she just the unluckiest woman in New York, or had death come back to assign her fate? It brings up an interesting, often overlooked side of many big disasters. While the focus of 9/11 discourse is usually the nearly 3,000 whose lives were lost, there were approximately 14,000 people in the World Trade Center who made it out that day. That's a significant enough number to assume that some of those 14,000 will statistically end up dying in other accidents. Dying in another plane crash is almost incalculably rare, but it is possible. It doesn't really prove that Hilda was part of death's design. Flight 180, on the other hand, had only 7 survivors, and all of them were dead in just over a year, which is much less statistically expected. And by the way, that 14,000 who got out of the World Trade Center doesn't even include the tens of thousands of others who almost died on 9/11. As it turns out, every single person I know has an uncle or cousin who was supposed to be at work in the Twin Towers that day, but ended up calling in sick. Comedian Seth McFarlane famously missed his flight on American Airlines Flight 11, which eventually crashed into the North Tower. McFarlane was running late because he was too hungover and arrived just after the doors had closed.
I'm not a fatalist. I was not shaken to the core in the way that I changed my whole outlook on life, mainly because I had missed planes before, and coincidences do happen.
It's strange to think that we almost ended up in the timeline with only 3 seasons of Family Guy.
Reminds me of that guy who was way too happy he didn't get killed on 9/11.
I'm 10 minutes late for work! Look at that!
Strangely, there are several other instances of plane crash avoiders who didn't last long after their initial stroke of good luck. The earliest one I found was in 1977, when the University of Evansville basketball team all perished on their December 13th charter flight, except for 18-year-old David Furr, who was sidelined with a season-ending ankle injury. Perhaps the world's first fortunate stint on the IL. This idea has always fascinated me before I even knew about this specific case. Imagine coming back next season with all new teammates and just seeing the ghosts of your old squad during every possession. Unfortunately for David, he'd never even got that far, because 2 weeks later, he died in a car crash. A similar thing happened in 2009, when Johanna Ganthler and her husband were on the way back home from a vacation in Brazil, but got to the airport late and missed their flight, which ended up going down over the Atlantic Ocean. They ended up getting a flight to Germany instead, with plans to rent a car and drive back to their home in Italy. But their vehicle swerved into the opposite lane and collided with a truck. Johanna didn't make it, but her husband did survive, which kind of disproves that this incident was a real-life example of death's design coming for them. But this next one appears to be more of a case of 2 people who were punished for cheating death until you dig into the details. details. The 2011 headline says, "Dad, daughter, who survived fiery air mishap in 2007, die in plane crash." However, you read on and you find out that they were both members of the Experimental Aircraft Association. In 2007, they had an emergency landing in their custom 3-passenger plane when the engine caught fire mid-flight. They decided not to permanently retire from experimental aviation and proceeded to crash in the woods in Texas 4 years later. I have one last plane crash example, but this one was basically predicted by a different Final Destination death scene. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 crashed during its descent to San Francisco in July 2013 due to flight crew mismanagement. Of the 307 passengers, there were only 2 fatalities directly resulting from the crash. One woman was struck by a dislodged door on the plane, and the other was Wang Linjia, a teen who wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was ejected from the plane. Her friend, Ye Mong Wan, was also not wearing a seatbelt, but she survived being thrown from the aircraft, according to the San Mateo County Coroner's Office. However, she didn't survive for long, because she was backed over by a fire truck that had showed up to extinguish the smoking aircraft.
Whoa, stop. There's a body right there.
Unfortunately, that warning ultimately did not prevent her from being run over after she became obscured by the foam sprayed by the fire department. And yes, for those meme lords in the audience who are wondering, I don't think it's the appropriate time to play the clip, but this was that Asiana flight. This was 10 years after Final Destination 2, which contained a very similar circumstance. FD2 follows the lives of a group who is saved by a college student whose premonition stops them from being part of a huge highway pileup. After realizing that they're still on death's to-do list, they do the dumbest thing possible, get together again to come up with a plan. A blown tire sends their truck careening off the road into some farming equipment. The driver, Kat, comes a couple inches from getting her head skewered, but she's basically fine. That is, until the first responders show up.
Could you be a little quieter with that thing, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll just put it on quiet mode.
That would be good.
I guess that's why they call them the Jaws of Death. There's also another scene in The Final Destination, also known as FD4, where someone is hit by an ambulance. So far, there are 5 Final Destinations, and only the first opens with a plane crash. So let's look at some of the other disasters that ended up coming true in real life. If you're a fan of the franchise, you may remember this explosive scene from the 4th movie.
I was meant to see this movie.
Bye-bye, suckers!
Janet was saved from the disaster at the racetrack, but nearly gets into another disaster in a movie theater. In 2012, sports journalist Jessica Gawai, stage name Jessica Redfield, may have learned just how it felt. Jessica had a blog, which she posted to on June 5th, 2012, to vent about her close call at Eaton Centre Mall in Toronto. I can't get this odd feeling off my chest. This empty, almost sickening feeling won't go away. I noticed this feeling when I was in the Eaton Centre in Toronto just seconds before someone opened fire in the food court. An odd feeling which led me to go outside and unknowingly out of harm's way. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around how a weird feeling saved me from being in the middle of a deadly. She goes on to explain how something uncharacteristically made her change her craving for sushi, causing her to get a burger instead. The time on her receipt said 6:20, but a funny feeling of panic caused her to go out into the rain for some fresh air. The gunshots rung out at 6:23. Had I not gone outside, I would have been in the midst of the gunfire. This is perhaps one of the most Final Destination-y cases out there, because it was a strange feeling that caused her to act out of character and miss her date with death. Very much like the visions that each main protagonist has at the beginning of every movie, causing them to act strangely, but ultimately escape the danger. I feel like I am overreacting about what I experienced, but I can't help but be thankful for whatever caused me to make the choices that I made that day. My mind keeps replaying what I saw over in my head. I hope the victims make a full recovery. I wish I could shake this odd feeling from my chest. The feeling that's reminding me how blessed I am. The same feeling that made me leave the Eaton Center. That feeling may have potentially saved my life. It was only a month later in Colorado that Jessica would find herself in another shooting, the tragic Aurora Theater shooting during the opening of The Dark Knight Rises. To be clear, I don't actually believe that something supernatural is going on here. At the end of the day, these are just unfortunate coincidences, but there is something kind of haunting about the idea that the cause of death was so similar to the one that she avoided the previous month. But she did live in the US, so this was bound to happen eventually. In fact, I also came across this story of 27-year-old Telemachu Zorfanos, who escaped the shooting at Mandalay Bay Hotel, Las Vegas in 2017, only to go down the following year when someone shot up a bar in Thousand Oaks, California. On a side note, I think the concert and movie theater shootings just hit especially hard. They're both supposed to be places to escape from the real world, but now whenever anyone gets up in a movie, I always start mapping out the exit route in my head, and I know I'm not the only one. The movie theater disaster wasn't the only scene from the fourth Final Destination that actually happened. The opening sequence of that movie depicts a stock car race where one of the drivers loses control, causing a chain reaction where automobiles and parts are launched into the stands at the defenseless crowd. We have to go way back to 1955 for this one, during the Le Mans motor race at Circuit de la Sarthe in France. It started when the leader pulled over for a pit stop, causing others to have to swerve out of the way. You can find breakdowns of exactly how it happened, but essentially one of the drivers ended up rear-ending someone who was decelerating and flipped out over the protective barrier. 84 people passed away, including the driver. Surprisingly, the race still went on to the finish, so his teammates, Ivor Bueb, reluctantly finished out the race, winning them first place. Hawthorne's career continued for another 4 years, at which point he retired, but apparently he could not shake the need for speed, because in January 1959, he died in a car wreck on the street in London while driving his Jaguar. He was overtaking a Mercedes, the same type of car that had caused the catastrophe at Le Mans. It was being driven by a racing team manager, and the two were traveling at about 80 miles per hour, leading to speculation that they had been racing. Some would say that his steering wheel had been grabbed by the bony hand of death, but in my opinion, this is a lot like the experimental airplane people. Hawthorne had a very dangerous hobby and career, and eventually it caught up with him. I also kind of wonder if his career accolades gave him a false sense of security, like he felt he could maneuver his way out of anything. In 1958, he won the French Grand Prix, a race in which his rival, Luigi Musso, slipped off the course and lost his life. Maybe Hawthorne just came to believe that he could do anything. Me, personally, I'll stick to Mario Kart. Maybe only hardcore fans know about this, but in addition to the movies, there's also a series of Final Destination novels. In 2005, the first of these, Final Destination Dead Reckoning, was released, and detailed the story about a punk rock singer who saves a few lives thanks to her vision about the nightclub that they were playing at collapsing. As it turns out, this too comes from a place of truth. There have been a number of very catastrophic nightclub fires over the years. I guess it makes some sense. In a crowded, loud place with low visibility, there probably isn't a very ideal escape plan. As we all saw during the beginning of Jennifer's Body. In real life, one of the deadliest fires in history was a nightclub in Massachusetts called Coconut Grove in 1942. The popular Boston club had numerous building code violations and went up in flames, taking out an insane 492 people. It's estimated that there were about 800 people crammed in there, which means about 300 survived. But 2 of those survivors went on to succumb to other accidents. 21-year-old Clifford Johnson was there on a first date, but they got separated in the panicked crowd. Johnson, a young Coast Guardsman, went back in 4 separate times to look for his date. She must have left a really good impression. But on the 4th attempt, he came out in a ball of flame. Doctors didn't expect him to make it, but he did, after 21 months of treatment. 14 years later, Johnson's car overturned in a freak accident, but this time he wasn't so lucky, and burned to death, making him probably one of the only people to experience the intensity of fatal burns twice. A cashier at the club, Jeanette Lanzoni, was one of several employees who knew about an escape route through a window in the kitchen. She died 16 years later after falling off an embankment and being hit by a train. When I first read about how she eventually died, I started to wonder if maybe there was some survivor's guilt at play here. Looking at the details, I think that's clearly not the case, but I think it's definitely a possibility for others. And it's possible that the next story is an example. In February 2013, a 21-year-old Jessica de Lima Roll had plans to attend a party that she'd helped organize at the Kiss nightclub in Brazil. As she was getting ready, her boyfriend, Adriano Stefanel, called her and begged her not to go. It's not clear if he believed he had some kind of premonition or if he was just worried she was gonna meet Chad at this club. But ultimately, she stayed home and avoided the fire that left 238 people dead. And this is always how it goes in a Final Destination movie. There's only one person who has a vision of the disaster, and he or she has to try to save as many lives as possible. But of course, not many are going to believe someone who claims to have had a premonition. In the real world, we call these people scammers, or at least I do. It's actually crazy to me how many psychics I see in LA. Like, who's keeping these people in business? 1 week after missing the fire, Jessica and her boyfriend were driving home together on a long-distance car trip, and they collided head-on with a truck. Obviously, no one knows exactly how this happened. Someone could have fallen asleep at the wheel for all we know. But the boyfriend's father seemed to believe that it was their destiny. I wonder if he would say the same about Bobby Leach, a daredevil who in 1911 miraculously became just the second person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel and live. With that kind of feat, you would think the dude must have figured out some kind of cheat code making him immune to fall damage. But no. As it turns out, he wasn't immune to fall damage at all, because in 1926, at the age of 68, he literally slipped on an orange peel and died. Okay, that's not the whole story. He fell and then his leg became infected and he got gangrene and then he died. But it was still the fall that ultimately led to his death. Also, I think we're really stretching the definition of the word barrel here. When I read about this, I was imagining more of a Donkey Kong looking barrel. This thing looks more like a space pod. Anyway, those are all of the most notable ones that feel like Final Destination in real life. As I already said, there are a lot of people in the world. On average, about 150,000 people die every day. And there are bound to be people who survive one accident, but not the next. Statistically, it's going to happen. It's the circumstances of some of these that make them feel so spooky. Like when it happens so soon after the near-death experience, when the cause of death is the same both times, or when there's some strange unexplained feeling that causes a person to change their behavior. I could stand here all day and talk about other examples of people who cheated death, like another Mandalay Bay survivor who died of a spinal injury in 2019, this school survivor who died of cancer in 2024, or this cancer survivor who was hit by a school bus also in 2024. But I think you get the idea that this happens all the time, which was a little surprising, because when I first set out to make this video, I thought it was going to be more about the unique methods by which the characters in the movies get whacked, and if any of them have ever actually happened. It all started when I saw a tweet, which I can no longer find, about a log truck losing its cargo on the highway, which of course was the catalyst for the Route 23 pileup at the beginning of FD2. Some sources online say that the Final Destination 2 scene was inspired by this story about a 125 car pileup that made national headlines in 2002. It was a pretty big story. I actually remember kids talking about it in school years later, like it had achieved some urban legend status. But did it inspire the screenwriters of FD2? Again, the answer is no. Filming had begun before the pileup even took place. I swear, people just see stuff and assume things and then write about it online as if it's a fact, and then it gets spread everywhere. I do believe that it was probably inspired by some log truck incident though, because I looked into it and this happens all the time. Just looking right now, it happened a month ago at the time of writing. The more I looked around, the more I realized I was just seeing the most recent cases, and I could essentially go back to any year on the modern internet and find a news story or video of a log truck absolutely eating it on the highway. So whenever you see those memes of a driver posting their POV with a caption about how they'll be keeping their distance, yeah, they're actually kinda right. Seems like these things are a ticking time bomb. Now, it's very possible that based on the amount of trucks that go out every day, the likelihood of this happening is comparatively very low, but hey, it doesn't hurt to keep your distance. Honestly, just looking at most of the accidents here, just stay out of a car entirely whenever possible. Those things are absolute death traps. Anyway, I thought I would go through the series and try to see which deaths have actually happened. Plane crash, yes, obviously. The first after that is Todd Wagner, who accidentally strangled himself with a clothesline. I found similar stories, like a boy who survived a freak clothesline accident and a murder using a clothesline, but no accidental clothesline death. Terry Chaney was hit by a bus, obviously that's happened. Miss Luton had a kitchen knife fall on her. I found plenty of stories about people who fell onto a knife, but not the other way around.
Well, turns out it happens more often than you think.
Billy Hitchcock was hit by flying debris from a train which had hit a car. I think it's fair to just file this under train crash, which obviously happens quite often at railroad crossings. Again, cars are total death traps. The first movie rounds out with Carter, who is crushed by a falling sign. It didn't take long to find an example of this. In 2023, a woman was crushed by a Denny's sign. I wonder if America's Diner stayed open after that one. Moving on to FD2, we find out that Alex Browning from the first movie was killed by a falling brick. This actually happens all the time. That's why they have those scaffolding tunnels at construction sites, but it can happen around neglected buildings as well. We already discussed the highway pileup, but after that we see Evan Lewis gets impaled with a fire escape ladder. There are plenty of accidents about people falling off of ladders, but when I search impaled by fire escape ladder, all I'm seeing is Mr. Lucky himself, so I'm pretty sure this one is unique to the movie. Tim Carpenter is crushed with a fallen glass pane. I actually found this video where that appears to be what's happening, and just poking around online, yes, it does happen from time to time. A lot like the falling brick thing. Tim's mom, Nora, is cut in half by an elevator. This does not happen very often, but there definitely are cases. We already talked about Kat Jennings. Obviously, there are airbag deaths, but I doubt this specific thing has happened. I didn't find anything similar. Rory Peters is sliced through by a flying fence. Like the knife thing, there are plenty of people who are done in by falling onto a fence, but I'm not gonna spend too long looking for one where the fence is the one moving towards the victim. Though, apparently this also happened on Desperate Housewives. Which is not something I thought I would ever play a clip from, ever. The last three characters, Eugene Dix, Clear Rivers, and Brian Gibbons, all die in explosions. There have even been hospital oxygen explosions and backyard grill explosions, just like in the movie. But what about the roller coaster? Why haven't I brought it up yet? The answer may surprise you. The opening disaster from Final Destination 3 is the Devil's Flight roller coaster, basically falling apart while they're riding it and just completely collapsing. Now, if we were to just classify this as roller coaster death, yes, it has happened. But you should know that coasters are actually one of the safest pastimes out there. According to data compiled by the National Safety Council, the odds of a severe injury on a fixed site ride at an amusement park is 1 in 15.5 million. This is even mentioned in the movie.
You're more likely to die driving to an amusement park than dying at one.
Because again, cars are death traps. I don't think there's ever been a case of a coaster falling apart during a ride and causing fatalities. There have been coasters that have been damaged during rides, but every coaster is built with multiple redundancies for safety. So if one thing fails, there are still two things protecting you. The YouTube channel Coaster College has a great video about how the disaster in FD3 could never actually happen. Anyway, after that, we see Ashley and Ashlyn cooked in their tanning bed. Someone was found dead in a tanning bed as recently as a month from writing, but the tanning bed didn't cause the death, he just happened to be there. And that was also the case in several other stories I found where corpses were discovered in tanning beds. According to Snopes, insta-death by tanning bed is just an urban legend. However, for some, tanning beds are actually a slow killer due to UV radiation, which can cause skin cancer. The next to go is Frankie, who is crushed in his car when struck with a runaway truck. Rollaway trucks are a real thing that happens, and there have been lives lost to them, so I'm gonna count it. Luis Romero was a football player whose head was crushed in the weight room. It may not be as graphic as Final Destination, but this does happen in real life. I don't think most people would be surprised by that. This is very avoidable by just knowing your limits and using the safety bars that are there for a reason. This is not your excuse to skip out on the gym. We are not about that here. Misery Business over here had her life stolen all away from her when she fell into a nail gun. So when it comes to fatal injuries at work, there's actually a database from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So if you search nail gun, you can see all the nail gun related injuries. And right here, the most recent one. On April 22, 2023, an employee was installing sheetrock backing. While climbing a 7 to 8 foot A-frame ladder, he shot himself in the chest with a Paslode nail gun. The employee sustained a fatal puncture wound to the right side of chest. Her boyfriend, Ian McKinley, also joined the Black Parade when he was crushed by a cherry picker. This was a little surprising to me, but yeah, I guess these things can fall over. The rest of our FD3 characters, Julie, Kevin, and Wendy, are all involved in a train derailment, and as you can imagine, this is something that's happened. However, in the US, you have a 1 in 243,000 chance of railway death, according to Statistica. In other words, locomotive travel is over 2,000 times safer than travel by car. You actually have almost a 1% chance of dying in a car. And that also only includes motor vehicle accidents, meaning that the death toll from pollution caused by cars, intentional weaponization of cars, and obesity caused by over-reliance on cars is not even factored into that statistic. It's actually insane that these things are still the dominant form of transport in so much of the world. People are really out here spending $50K on basically a 2,000-pound dye box. We've already talked about a lot of the fourth Final Destination, which began with the racetrack. After that, there's Carter Daniels, a tow truck driver who gets stuck on a hook and ends up being dragged behind his truck. The scene itself is a reference to the murder of James Byrd Jr., an African-American man who was dragged behind a pickup truck by white supremacists in 1998. So the Final Destination scene is an inversion of that. The racist tow truck driver is setting up hate symbols in a man's yard when he gets hooked by his towing winch as his car slowly pushes forward. I guess the explosion is what actually finishes him off, but he was only in the proximity because he was stuck on the towing winch. So unfortunately, this is kind of an established method of torture, but has it ever happened by accident like in the movie? I only found one that seemed to be an accident. I guess it's up for debate. In 2016, a 28-year-old woman was found in San Antonio. According to witnesses, she saw her vehicle being towed and chased after it, but became caught in the dollies underneath her rear tires. That might be the most painful sounding one on here, because it's so drawn out. I know burning is usually considered to be the worst way to go, but at least that would be over quicker? I don't know. Samantha Lane is the next victim, and she gets knocked out of the running when she's hit with a rock ejected from under a lawnmower. They actually tried to cover this on Mythbusters, but never reached a conclusion because Adam was too afraid to continue. Sadly, it did happen to a landscaper in 2015, but before you use this as an excuse to never mow the lawn again, OSHA said that the incident could have been prevented, but the mower's discharge chute was broken and the company failed to repair it. The next accident chronologically sees Andy Kuzer diced through a fence after getting launched by a gas tank. As I mentioned earlier, there are fence injuries from people falling on fences. I'll also add that there are electric fences that can be dangerous, and of course people driving into fences, which is more of a car death than a fence death, but nothing like how Andy went out. One of the more infamous ones is Hunt Wynorski, who gets trapped by the suction of a pool drain and disemboweled. This has happened. It actually came up pretty early in my research. Very tragic. It was a 6-year-old girl. She actually survived at first thanks to an organ transplant, but that ultimately only bought her another 9 months. This first happened in 2007 at a country club in Minneapolis, and the filming of The Final Destination began in March 2008. The scene in the movie also takes place at a country club, so I think it's very likely that this is another direct reference. I'm not gonna lie, at first I did find it to be kind of in poor taste. I know, that's hypocritical based on what I said earlier, and it probably is because I can put a name and face to the victim, whereas with TWA 800, just the image of a plane comes to mind. But then I was thinking about how the tow truck death reversed the roles of the James Byrd racism incident, so maybe this one is meant to be more of a shot at the country club, who is blamed for not repairing the drain that the real-life victim got caught in. I try to give the benefit of the doubt, but yeah, that's that one. Pretty sad. But back in the world of the movie, Jonathan Groves is the next in line, and he's crushed by an overflowing bathtub from the room above that breaks through the ceiling. I initially assumed that this was true because I had heard of this happening before. But when I looked deeper into the story, I realized that it may be based around a lie. When I went to look up the story of a bathtub crashing through from a floor above, I found this headline: "New fear unlocked, woman says bathtub fell through floor while she was in it." The article was written about a TikTok, which on top of incorrectly using the term POV, doesn't include any images or footage of the damaged floor. The 5-minute story time also doesn't include any images, and then she claims that she can only send it to people who follow her on Instagram. She can't just post it on Instagram, or post it in the TikTok that you're watching right now. Now don't you dare suggest that she's lying. I mean, who would lie about playing hide and seek in a trash can and getting trapped in a garbage truck for 8 hours? That is so disrespectful. I can't believe you would accuse her of lying in order to get attention online and grow her social media following. Have you no respect for the journalistic integrity of a 20-year-old who shakes her ass on TikTok? Moving on, I already touched on George Lanter, who was hit by the ambulance. This one is true. The movie theater explosion ended up being avoided thanks to another premonition, but this did happen in 1964. The final 3, Janet, Lori, and Nick, are hit by a truck that crashes through a wall. This happens all the time. I'm sensing a pattern here about automobiles being dangerous.
The damage here paints a clear picture of the path this truck took before killing an 18-year-old girl and sending her father into critical condition.
David Sosa saw the truck and trailer in a home on Jason Court.
A white pickup truck crashed into a home in Shelby, North Carolina.
A semi coming off the freeway somehow wound up crashing into a home.
The list goes on and on. The last film of the original set before the 2025 revival was Final Destination 5, released in 2011. The opening disaster is a suspension bridge collapse, which seems to be a pretty rare event, especially when you're looking at large steel motorway bridges like the North Bay Bridge in the movie. One recent one I came across was in 2021 in Chile. The bridge buckled under the weight of... oh my god, you are not gonna believe this. It's like 2 Final Destination events in one. From what I can tell, thankfully, nobody was actually killed on this one, but there are definitely other bridge collapses that had fatalities, which could be attributed to weather phenomenon, external impacts such as ships striking a bridge, corrosion of materials, or older bridges not being designed to hold the oversized vehicles of today. One of the most drawn out accidents in all of Final Destination lore is the gymnastics accident, where after a series of lead-up events, Candace Hooper slips off the uneven bars and breaks her spine. This exact thing happened to a Southern Connecticut State University athlete in 2019, and people were quick to point out the similarity to the memorable gymnastics practice scene. Next up is Isaac Palmer. Technically, his cause of death is blunt force trauma by a Buddha statue falling on his head, but it's part of a series of events that happens in a massage parlor, so I'll just look for acupuncture deaths. According to an editorial from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, there have been about 90 deaths caused by poorly placed needles, usually due to an acupuncture needle penetrating a vital organ. I know a lot of people with contacts are hesitant to get LASIK eye surgery to correct their vision because of the scene where Olivia Castle gets stuck in the machine and the laser malfunctions, burning through her corneas and, in the end, causing her to crash through the window. I am not one of those people who was scared off by the scene. I got the surgery a couple years ago. I am getting eye surgery soon, that's why I'm wearing glasses lately. And then you can see my eyes healing in my Scream 2 video the following week, which is totally normal, by the way. Of course, I did bring up Final Destination to the doctor. I was not too nervous, but I was curious if other people were, and he had no idea what I was talking about. He had actually never heard of it, which is really shocking to me. I thought the scene was like the first thing that people thought of when they're thinking about LASIK. But maybe it just feels like that because I'm CZsWorld and I live and breathe horror movies. Anyway, LASIK is very safe. The worst thing that can happen is a condition called post-LASIK corneal ectasia, which affects about 6 out of every 10,000 people, depending on where you get your data from. No one has ever died during the surgery, and from a personal standpoint, I think it's one of the best investments I've ever made in myself. The next person that death sets its sights on is Dennis Lapman, who takes a wrench through the skull. If you don't think that this one is possible, you are wrong. A Chinese man probably gets the award for most miserable 2020 because he spent time in a hospital after a wrench dropped by a worker on a high-rise became lodged in his skull. This particular guy survived. I honestly just wanted to show you his x-ray because it's pretty crazy. But this Alabama woman in 2024 was not so lucky. At the end of Final Destination 5, the characters come to believe in this death transfer rule, and long story short, one of the last survivors tries to kill the others, which results in an FBI agent being shot, don't think you need me to tell you that that's happened in real life, and Peter Friedkin is impaled on an industrial meat skewer. This is a pretty obscure story, but in 2007, a man in the UK was found murdered in his home by a 22-inch barbecue skewer. As far as I can tell, no suspect was ever found, meaning the meat skewer murderer may still be out there in the English countryside, watching, waiting, salivating. Final Destination 5 ended up being the most accurate to life of the bunch, with 85% of its disasters being true, while FD2 was the least accurate at 62%. Overall for the franchise, 72.9% of the disasters we see in the movies have actually happened in real life. This may be part of why the series has so much staying power. These deaths really stick in the mind of the audience and take advantage of our survival instincts by putting us on high alert when we encounter a situation similar to the ones in the movies. There's even a subreddit called Final Destination IRL where people post incidents that remind them of the 2000s horror series. Most of it is just people cautiously posting themselves driving behind log trucks or their encounters with the ominous numbers that come up repeatedly in the film. But some of them, and honestly the ones that I find the most interesting, are the cases that aren't a repeat of something that happened in Final Destination, but something that feels like it could have been in Final Destination. The craziest one I came across was in 1988 in Buenos Aires. It started with a poodle who fell from a 13th floor balcony. 13, of course, is an unlucky number that comes up many times in the series. It's seen on Eugene's keychain, which starts a nearly fatal chain reaction in FD2. Officer Burke is part of Unit 13.
This is Unit 13 requesting medical assistance and backup for a major traffic accident.
And the news station that reports on the bridge collapse is Channel 13, just to name a few. So the poodle lands on a woman's head, immediately killing them both. But another woman who saw a crowd forming around them crossed the street to get a better look, where she was hit by a bus and killed. But it didn't end there, because a man who saw this happen suffered a heart attack, and he became the 4th life lost on that tragic Friday. This is all pretty wild stuff, and as a fan of Final Destination, it's kind of fascinating to see how such a ridiculous set of movies can line up with reality every once in a while due to basically statistical chance. But what can we really take away from this? Why did I make this video? For one, I think it's a reminder about how fragile life can be. It feels like you can basically make up a cause of death and look through some obituaries and find someone who died that way 6 times out of 10. And 2, I think it's important to consider the opposite too. If you saw a LASIK surgery gone wrong or a roller coaster disaster on film and became afraid of those things, I think it's a good idea to look at the actual chances of those things happening. You may find that they're a lot safer than a lot of the things you may do every day. Especially if you find yourself encountering a lot of log trucks. Those things you should probably just stay away from. Remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell for all notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.